and we're excited to cover the Green Jobs Report. We'll have an abbreviated Green Jobs Report, and we'll actually do a little bit preview of Intel and what's going on in the jobs in Ohio. So I want to welcome soon to be Dr. Amir Khalegi, soon to be a PhD this year, from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. So Amir, tell us the latest about the Green Jobs Report, and then after that, and a quick overview of Ohio, we'll bring on Carolyn Harding and Dr. Fed El-Kaboub.
So thank you, Paul. So for those of you just joining us, HIP Investor and the Global Institute of Prosperity, we've been producing a Green Jobs Report, and actually today marks our 2-year anniversary of providing this monthly Green Jobs Report, which does analytics on data-driven insights on the move towards a greener, more sustainable economy. From HIP Invest, we use their analytics on over 2,000 HIP-rated entities, company entities, and they're cross-mapped to industry data provided by the current unemployment statistics survey. HIP rates and analyzes these companies based on 7 pillars of health, wealth, earth, equality, trust, products and services, and management practices. Once cross-mapped, these companies are bucketed into extractive, slightly extractive, and green industries using a weighted industry HIP rating. Our analysis finds that for employment, greener jobs have been the most resilient to job loss while also paying the highest wages. So let's get into it. When looking at green industries and unemployment, we found that greener industries have consistently had the lowest unemployment, even when looking at the onset of the COVID-19 recession. We can see extractive industries peaked around 35% in terms of unemployment, while green industries peaked around 9%. And to date, green industries still display the lowest unemployment rate, while extractive industries are still displaying the highest unemployment rate. The average unemployment rate for the US economy right now is around 3.8 as well. When looking at the cumulative difference from the February 2020 level, we can see that in February 2020, there was a peak employment of 129.7 million in the total private employment. But when the impact of COVID-19 happened, we can see that extractive industries were reduced by around 18.5%, while again, green industries were reduced from that employment base by only around 7%. And to date, green industries was the first industry bucket to make it past the February 2020 level, being the only industry bucket to pass that threshold. Extractive industries are still 2.2% below its February 2020 level. Over the month, we saw a positive change of 740,000, and the current employment level in absolute terms is 128.3 million. So we see that greener jobs are more resilient, but even in terms of pay, it's very significant. When estimating annual average earnings, we can see that greener industries have a significant margin over all other industry buckets, with around 81,000 average annual pay, which equates to around $45 per hour. While extractive industries again has the lowest amount of pay, with around 48,000, with an average of $27 per hour. Along with having the highest pay, over the past decade, we can see a trend that greener industries have had the highest wage growth in comparison to slightly extractive and extractive. So, along with paying employees the highest average wage, they're doing more to continue and expand that pay for the employees within that industry group. Then we do an analysis on the hipness of the economy. So what we can see here was that in the onset of the COVID-19 recession, we actually had a higher HIP rating, and that is due to the reduction of extractive and slightly extractive industries to a very high degree. Recalling back to the unemployment rate of extractive industries, there was a reduction, or not a reduction, there was an unemployment rate of 35%. And then, even still, a unemployment rate of around 15% for slightly extractive industries. And due to those reductions in employment, we actually had a higher economy HIP rating because green industries were more resilient. But as we can see, there has been a general downtrend in the hipness of the economy as unemployment reduced, signifying that we're not actually building back better. We are unfortunately building back to the same trends in terms of extractive and slightly extractive industries. Thankfully, though, a silver lining from the turn of the year, we're starting to uptrend as unemployment reduces. So hopefully, as we track these new developments, it will continue on this trend. But we'll be here to report it as that new data comes out. So the big discussion for today is looking at Intel and the implications on not only employment, jobs, but the environmental sustainability that will come from the infrastructure and the changes that will be happening to Ohio due to this new Intel deal. So with that being said, Paul can take it away, and I'll pull up the analysis on Intel featured by HIP Investor and the portal that they provide.
Great. Thanks, Amir, and thanks for the overview. And then just to reiterate, green jobs are more resilient. Green jobs typically pay more. And whether it's COVID or a growing economy, there's a need for more green jobs and less extractive jobs. As we transition a conversation about Intel, Intel actually commits to a lot of sustainability goals. So as we dive into this conversation today, know that they're a leader in the semiconductor industry, that they do have commitment to diversity, they do have commitment to water efficiency. And as you scroll down, Amir, to the next set of bars, across all the pillars of earth, health, wealth, equality, trust, Intel generally rates high. It generally rates as a more sustainable company. But it is not a perfectly sustainable company. There are very few perfectly sustainable companies, but it's at least an industry leader compared to other semiconductor companies. So you can see more about this on the hipinvestor.com portal site, where we roll up 30 different metrics from employee pay and CEO pay to gender diversity and racial diversity, as well as some of the environmental metrics around energy, water, waste, and emissions. Amir, if you go back to the slides, let's dig into where the new semiconductor fabrication facility is going, and what that means for the geography of Ohio and maybe for the jobs of Ohio.
Perfect. So we can begin with, what Paul was saying in terms of Intel being a leader in the semiconductor industry space. From Intel's 2020 and 21 corporate responsibility report, they have made commitments to renewable energy. By 2030, they have pledged 100% renewable energy across all of its operations. They've also stated that they want to cut Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions by 10% during that same time period. And as will be discussed today, in terms of water usage, which is a hot button issue, Intel's goal is to conserve 60 billion gallons of water by 2030, while also funding external water restoration projects. So doing a deep dive into the geography of Columbus, Ohio, we can see here that Columbus, Ohio is, relatively well employed, but below the national average of unemployment rates. So this current month is actually 3.8, but we can still see with the most recent numbers that Columbus, Ohio, and the surrounding counties, the whole area that encompasses the Columbus, Ohio, is around 3.7% unemployment. If you're looking to the right, we can see average weekly wages for each county. The proposed factory location will be in New Albany, Ohio, which has around 41,000 annual salary for employees in Licking, and for Franklin around 52,000 or more. But what this implicates, especially with a low unemployment rate already, is investigating how Intel will source these new jobs that will be coming in. Currently, there's direct employment by Intel of around 3,000 employees, and indirect employment has been estimated upwards of the tens and thousands. So indirect employment might be the construction, that will be needed, the jobs that will be created through that, and also the talks of their suppliers coming in to the jobs from the supply chain that will happen to supply the Intel factory. So moving on as well, we can see the over the year changes in employment for the Columbus, Ohio area. We can see that construction, logging, and mining has had in the top quartile of percent change over the year, and it's likely to, these industry sectors of construction, manufacturing, professional and business services, education and health services will see a stark uptick due to the jobs and opportunities that Intel will hopefully sustainably provide. And a lot of the discussion that we will have today is kind of thinking about what will Intel do for keeping jobs within the state of Ohio, and what are the implications in terms of housing, education, to support the influx of new employees coming in. So with that, looking at the economic perspective of the area, we can kind of transition into our formal discussion.
Thank you, Amir. Thanks for this monthly update and the deep dive into Ohio. So that's a great foundation for our conversation. So really appreciate your analytical rigor and setting the context. All right, so let's dive deep into our discussion. I want to welcome Carolyn Harding, who is working for social justice and environmental justice in Ohio and the Midwest, and Dr. Fadel Kaboub, president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity and a professor at Denison University. And let's dive deep into Intel Inside Ohio. So Carolyn, welcome. What can you tell us about what's happening on the ground, and what issues we should keep in mind with regards to people and planet and trust?
Hi, thank you so much for having me here today. Well, January 21st, 2022, it was a huge surprise breaking news of the Intel plans. And they're committing $20 billion to build the largest in the world Intel plant. And they will build at least 2 semiconductors or fabs on this 1,000-acre site. They will research, develop, manufacture, employing 3,000 people, and construction should start soon. And this is from the president. Our expectation is that this becomes the largest silicon manufacturing location on the planet. CEO Pat Gelsinger told Time. The company has the option to eventually expand to 2,000 acres and up to 8 fabs. We hope to establish the Silicon Valley. He said, no, we did establish the Silicon Valley, he said, and now we're going to do the Silicon Heartland. Okay, so I'm an environmental activist and water protector. So my background, I got involved 10 years ago because of the fracking introduction into Ohio and empowerment by the government. At that time was Governor John Kasich. And the government bent over backwards to deal with open up regulations, make it very, very business friendly. And folks, it sounded good, clean energy, we'll have independence, energy independence. But there is always, with everything, there's the dark side, and the fracking natural gas burns clean, but the waste stream is huge. So concerned citizens started finding out about the waste stream, the water and the solid waste. And we got involved in raising awareness about it and just, pushing back on the industry because it can get into our water supply and have severe health impacts on our communities. So the Intel industry is going to be huge. It's going to impact a very rural community that's primarily farmland and next to some communities that are growing. But there are a lot of people nearby this proposed huge facility. So folks that are concerned about air and water and communities aren't buying this squeaky clean image that Intel has presented. And I did a lot of reading just online with Google, and almost everything just looks so good. They're going to be net zero, they're going to be 100% renewable, sustainable. I had to dig a little deeper to see that their past hasn't always been so clean. And there have been a lot of communities impacted with air pollution, with water depletion, because this industry takes a lot of water and it takes a lot of energy. So, number one, the issues that concerned citizens have about Intel is that it came in very secretively. And many leaders in these smaller communities and townships didn't even really know what was going on. So why is this coming in so secretly and quietly? That's a big warning flag. And then our government, our governor is up for re-election, and he has been embroiled in all kinds of negative press with the district maps and with HB6, and this could be an incredible win for him to bring in what we need for our wind turbines, our solar panels, our electric cars, our computers. I mean, we all use microchips. So how do we deal with this? I'm grateful for your work, your economic and your statistical work. But the work that I do is to make sure that these industries and choices aren't going to destroy communities, our water and our air, our soil. And so folks need to be more educated, wake up and realize that this is huge. It's going to turn this rural patch of farmland into a huge industrial complex with huge smokestacks. And so I just want to dive into that a little bit. In Arizona, they have a 700-acre campus, and there's 3 fabs or factories on their campus. And they consume more than 800 million gallons of water just in the 3rd quarter of 2021. So we're wondering, where does this water come from? that's going to supply Intel. The city of New Albany purchases its water from the city of Columbus. And so we know about the city of Columbus water supply because we've been, dealing with that with the frack waste. And currently, the city of Columbus does not even really track the frack waste or the oil and gas effects on its water supply. So that's an issue that even Intel should be concerned about. And some of the other communities that have an Intel facility, the city has been working in combination with Intel to pipe in water from their river, from a river. Let's see, that's in Oregon. So it's massive amounts of water. Now, Intel has evolved and they are, reclaiming some of this water and recycling some of this water. And it seems to be like a third of what they can use, what they do use, they can recycle. So still, if, right now Ohio has a lot of water, but we've been in drought, we've had drought. And so that might be an issue coming down the road. And how will they filter this wastewater? And what will they do with the filters? Because it will be highly contaminated. And how will they return this water to our water system, our aquifers? And how will they be regulated? So these are concerns of ours because, without water, without clean water, we don't have a safe community. So currently, Columbus is not monitoring for the impacts of radioactive oil and gas waste in the Columbus metro watershed. And Intel depends on very, very, very clean water to do their microchip work. So that's something they should be aware of as well. An activist in Washington County Citizens Action Network raised the fact that this industry uses PFASs, or forever chemicals, in the processing. And PFASs are a group of chemicals used to make fluoropolymer coatings and products that resist heat, oil stains, grease, and water, but they're also considered the forever chemicals. And we don't need that in our drinking water. So how is Intel dealing with that? As part of an effort to regain its position as a leading maker of semiconductors amidst a global chip shortage, Intel is committing to $20 billion to build a manufacturing mega site on New Albany. Hold on, excuse me. I already covered that. Let's go to energy. That's also a huge need for Intel. I mean, like in Taiwan, the computer chip factory that supplies Apple takes up 5% of the energy of the whole area, Taiwan. So it's like huge. So Intel's 700-acre campus in Arizona, again, 3 factories, used more than 509 million kilowatt hours of electricity in the third quarter of 2021. They also claimed that it'll be 100% renewable energy, but they are using energy credits to count for renewable energy, not truly renewable energy like solar or like wind farms. So some microchip factories are beginning to build their own solar factories and their own wind farms to provide truly renewable energy. And we, concerned citizens, should stand that Intel would do the same thing, because energy credits basically pay for a solar or a wind farm somewhere, but not necessarily in Ohio. And we know in Ohio, there's only 3% of renewable energy in Ohio, because the legislators in Ohio have fought left and right to keep oil and gas and coal as number one. So these credits will actually be burning oil and gas and coal. So we need Intel to lead and to build their own solar or their own wind and be truly renewable. And then there's pollution. Some communities have been forced to sue Intel for the lack of air pollution control. According to one individual who sued Intel in Hillsboro, Oregon, they do only what they are forced to do. So, as any money-making enterprise, they want to make profits. And if they can get away with it, they do. I know their PR is super good and they look super good, but we need our state to hold them accountable. We need the local governments to hold them accountable, and we're probably going to have citizens hold them accountable.
Thank you, Caroline. I wanted to jump in here and say a couple of things. One is everything you've highlighted is exactly what needs to be on the table for the public discourse right now. Yes, the deal came as a surprise to everyone. It was kind of worked out behind closed doors. But there's going to be the pros and cons here, and we've highlighted all the major question marks, red flags that we need to put in front of the legislators, in front of informed citizens, so that we get this done the right way. Because in a sense, this is everything we've been asking for, right? High-tech jobs, localizing the supply chains, creating jobs that pay well, that are local, but also we've always wanted all of these jobs to be sustainable, to have a positive impact on the community and on the environment. And this is now the part that we're not sure about, we're questioning, and we want to set up the right way. For example, just to illustrate a point you made earlier, we've been hearing reports about potentially 7,000 construction jobs. That's great, but that's only the construction phase. After the construction phase, the number of jobs is actually relatively smaller, at least for the initial plant. Intel is saying about 3,000 jobs, paying on average $135K per year. It's not very clear yet if the majority of those jobs will be people moving to the area, or jobs that actually hire people from Ohio, from this part of the country. The skill sets needed are not necessarily all here. So what are we doing as a state, as a local community, to work with Intel to make sure that the training programs are up and running before the factory opens, so that young people are kind of on-ramped into these programs, so that we hire from the local community and create kind of the community economic multiplier effect from within. There's also, it's interesting, The Guardian published an interesting piece a while ago about the specific technology that Intel and its competitors use for the etching that happens on the silicon wafers, which is very high-tech, high-precision etching. They use toxic gases for cleaning sort of the debris from the silicon wafers. And in recent years, there's been new developments for alternative gases that are not toxic, that can be used for these factories. The big question that everybody's asking, which technology will Intel set up in Ohio? Are they going to use the old technology with the old toxic gases? And once you do that, it's really hard to kind of upgrade it afterwards, after they spend hundreds of millions of dollars on the technology. Or will they start this new factory with the most sustainable technology available on the market, with these alternative gases that are not toxic? We haven't heard anything about the specifics of the technology. And then finally, something to put on the table for all of us to discuss here, which is the role of the state. The state is obviously very excited, very happy about bringing the biggest investment in the history of Ohio to Central Ohio. And the state has already committed a minimum of $1 billion worth of infrastructure prep work, essentially, to prepare the land, so to speak, and the infrastructure. And that's, for the rest of the state, the commitment of $1 billion in one geographic location also means lack of availability of resources in other parts of the state, because the state at the same time gave a substantial tax break to Intel, above and beyond what we normally give to any out-of-state investor. So all of these questions for us in Ohio, this is hyper local, even though this announcement is a national, even global in its dimension. A lot of people are talking these days about the end of globalization as we know it, in the sense of many countries, including the EU, focusing now on the concept of technological sovereignty and bringing some strategic components of the global supply chains in a more regional level as opposed to a global supply chains. So for us in Ohio, these are the big questions that remain unanswered. And this webinar is a great opportunity to engage in this conversation with Paul, with Nigel, and with the audience, and with you as well, because you've been on the front lines of protecting the Ohio's water for many years. And water is going to be one of the biggest real resource challenges. 5 million gallons per day is what this plant requires immediately. So these are some of the challenges and some of the big questions we have. The last thing I want to add, Paul, before we open it up for the conversation, is beyond the role of the state, what is the role of the federal government in making sure that environmental standards are met, and making sure that, committing all the resources to one small pocket of central Ohio doesn't also mean neglect of the rest of the state in terms of the economic impact that this is going to have. Schools need new buildings because we're going to have thousands of new people moving to the area. All kinds of new dynamics will be unfolding. And if it's not done the right way, there's going to be a pocket of jobs and wealth and economic activity, and other pockets of neglect and potential socioeconomic exclusion. That's not the way we want it. We want this done the right way from the get-go.
So yeah, thanks for those introductions and overviews, Carolyn and Fadel. So in this conversation, we like to focus on solutions as well as like structural solutions across sectors, across the whole system. So Carolyn, what solutions and solution sets are possible given the situation, which has been, declared, and the dollars are being committed and some of the deals are being made? What are the either checks and balances? What are the systems, structural solutions? What can or should be done next?
There needs to be more transparency. Community leaders need to be part, and the community members need to be part of it. Something that's going to impact their lives, our lives forever from now on in this area. That's number one. The most stringent water protection regulation and air protection, because that's been a big problem with some of their former factories, is the air pollution in the communities. And a lot of times the air pollution is under regulation. It's within the regulation that's allowed, but the communities are still feeling harm. So the community has to be very much a part of it, of keeping in touch and enforcing community-friendly changes. So I would think transparency, strict water regulations, strict emissions, and also the energy. They need to make that part of their big money, spending, build a solar array or build a wind farm to provide renewable energy, and not just rely on these credits that are, paying, some wind farm in Oklahoma or something like that. So those are big ones. And then they need to provide living wages to those at the bottom level, and open to unions, and make sure that they have equality in hiring. And I know they've put money, 100 million toward 100
Education.
million towards education.
training.
Right. So working with the universities, working with the two-year colleges, and we're wondering how they will work with the K to, K to 8 as well. So those are where I'm coming from. And then, the tax abatements, 30 years. This Intel has a 30-year tax abatement. And, that's going to
Just to
impact the school.
clarify, Carolyn, normally Ohio gives 15 years for.
They just
for the
changed
big
it last
allocated
year.
budget. Yeah.
Right. They changed it last year for this, I'm sure that,
Yeah.
So, and then, it's going to have a huge impact in all kinds of ways, but those are primary. I don't like the corporate welfare. I don't think an industry needs this much tax abatement. They make a lot of profits, and our children in our services need the funds for the education and for where our tax monies go. So, and I don't think it's at all insightful for the government not to include local governments and the local people. So it's just kind of dropped in the middle of Ohio, middle of or actually on the outskirts of Columbus. So, yeah. And I think that they have a community environmental work group that they like to, facilitate. But I doubt that's going to be as robust and honest as a true community working group that really focuses on the water and the energy and in the impact of the community. And are we prepared for our medical care for all these new people, for the we're going to be building infrastructure and housing. Already Columbus has a housing shortage, and the rents have skyrocketed. Many people are being forced out of their homes because the rents are getting so high. So that's another whole different conversation. But we are housing this area. People are moving here, and this is a area where people can hardly buy a house, and the rents are getting higher and higher. So that's an area that we need to address. I don't want to keep monologuing, Fidel.
Yeah, Paul, it's interesting actually, in this webinar series with ESGX, we're coming full circle to some of the topics, because when we talked about the inflation, we talked about some of the actual sources of inflation pressure points, and part of it was the supply chains and so on. So now we're addressing the supply chain situation in the long term by relocating some of these industries. But now we're actually potentially creating additional inflation pressure points in a place like Central Ohio, because when you bring in so much investment into a small geographic area, it leads to all of these things that Carolyn was mentioning. Higher demand for housing when we have housing shortages, higher demand for energy, and we haven't built the renewable energy infrastructure, higher demand for water, for broadband, for school infrastructure. All of it has to happen sort of simultaneously so that we're not creating additional ripple effects from this massive investment and actually causing further shortages and disruptions, and as a result, inflation. And this brings us full circle to where we started all of these conversations with large-scale national level investments and all the above. And that's things like the Green New Deal, which targets specifically housing at the national level, infrastructure, broadband infrastructure, renewable energy infrastructure, water infrastructure at the national level. So yes, the state of Ohio can bring this deal and can create so many jobs and create all of this stuff, but the unintended consequences of not having a strategic macro policy to go along with it will not be necessarily all positive. And that's why the federal government is sort of, celebrating bringing Intel back to the United States in Central Ohio, but it's not committing the resources from the federal government to actually eliminate the potential unintended consequences related to housing, related to additional energy demand, water infrastructure, education and training, right? Especially for technical skills and so on. So again, as Caroline said earlier, there is the biggest concern that we have is the lack of transparency. And once we have transparency and open discussion, it's these issues that need to be on the table for both Intel, the state and local authorities, but also the federal government has to play its role in making sure that this is actually a net positive for the United States, not just for Intel and a few people.
There's a great question. There's a great question in here around just, can we give like some kind of quantification around the tax abatement? And I think the thing for me is, it seems like a damning indictment of American entrepreneurship and its corporate sector if the only way you can create new jobs, which are desperately needed as automation eats up many of the jobs that there are today, if you can only do that and not pay taxes. So can we quantify the extent of not paying taxes which is involved, how that compares to some of the commitment to education and over what time frame? Because $100 million sounds like a nice big number, but if that's over 30 years, it's only a few $1 million a year. It's some small part of the CEO's annual compensation. Is there any quantification we can put on it, Fadl?
Not that I have the numbers here, but related to this particular concern, there's actually quite a few studies, rigorous studies about this idea of giving tax incentives to attract businesses to a particular geographic location. And most of the studies essentially found that 75 to 98% of business incentives have no impact on the decisions of firms to relocate, expand or retain workers, because these are decisions that have already been made based on internal kind of a cost-benefit analysis, and essentially once the decision is made, then they go out and apply pressure on local states and municipalities to get the most out of it and to allow kind of two cities to compete for their business. But and I'll put a link here in the chat to some of the work that I'm citing here. So that's another big question. Was Intel coming to Ohio anyway, with or without the abatements? So that's a question we don't know the answer to, because this was not an open and transparent process.
The one thing that, from a systems perspective, system cuts across sectors. So there's the business sector. Intel is part of the business sector. There's nonprofit sector and activists, Carolyn, that's been part of your heritage and history. There's academic sector, Fadl, you're part of that. There's government sector, and Carolyn, you're running for Ohio State Legislature. So some metrics that can be used across that, now one of those frames is the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. And Intel and other companies are starting to make commitments to those Sustainable Development Goals. But these Sustainable Development Goals also need to operate across sectors, because no one problem can be solved by any one sector. So Carolyn, have you thought about what design might work, whether it be water, like you've done previous work in, fracking, to, combat fracking and the quality of water? Or is there anything about funding muni bonds that have specific accountability metrics of learning technical skills, learning STEM? Part of historical research shows that math and engineering skills don't always get encouraged for girls as well as boys, and that part of that is sort of bias at the teacher level, but that when connected to real world problems, girls sometimes excel. That helps girls continue their journey into science and technology. And so that's why at Carnegie Mellon, for example, the first year computer engineering courses include environment and biology and medicine, and not just physics. And that helps keep low attrition. So from that, from that talent perspective, say, as well as from an environmental perspective, what additional structures, besides the transparency and having the local engagement, what additional structures can help facilitate some of those cross-sector solutions?
Education.
Mhm.
And I'm not sure I totally understand your question, but it sounds, what's the word? It sounds like your economist language. So I'm not sure I understand what you mean.
Well, for example, Intel historically sometimes gets called out for not having enough women engineers.
Okay.
So how will more women engineers be created in the Ohio education system, starting at K-12, moving into colleges and universities? For a while, Intel sponsored the high school science competitions, and until they stopped funding them because of missing some quarterly earnings, they were won more and more by young women and girls winning the engineering competitions. So it's these types of blending education, maybe nonprofits in terms of STEM education, hiring practices at Intel. Connecting those dots together can help to bring the capacity of talent and expertise to then solve that. And then because girls and women are attracted to science to solve real world problems, ecology, environment, medicine, biology, that's another cross-sector approach.
Well, you can see women are the leaders in water protecting too, in the indigenous communities and all the rural, and even in our city, the women are leading in protecting our water. And yes, I am all for empowering women to study STEM and to become engineers, and I am encouraged that Intel has learned from some of their past huge mistakes. And I feel that we have to hold them to the top accountability of what they've learned, and don't accept any of their halfway policies that are cheaper. We want to hold them to the top, the most environmentally stringent. And women are good at that too. Women are good at holding players accountable. So no, I'm not against microchips. We need them. What I am for is not defaulting, not saying, oh, they'll take care of us. The government will take care of us. The company's doing a good thing. Look how clean they are. Just doesn't work that way. And so folks need to be aware that there's possible huge pollution, that we need to be aware, and we need to hold this company to the standards it is aspiring to. And yes, inclusive, yes, and employ women of color, women, all men, every kind of person. Yes. And I think, but that's not a worry of mine. I mean, I don't.
Can I add another dimension to this question? I think the issue of investing in future Intel employees is fundamentally about education. And when we're talking about the future Intel employees, they're in kindergarten right now. They're in middle school right now. So we're talking about funding both from Intel and from the state, across the state, not just in Central Ohio, for after school programs, STEM programs, summer camps, internships, community college training programs to onboard the next generation of Intel employees at the highest end of the pay scale, not just the entry level, not just the, because when you think about this particular Intel plant, some of the quite a bit of the media coverage doesn't actually mention that there's actually other Silicon Valley companies already committed to relocating with Intel. There's at least 6 or 7 that have announced that they're moving. So in economics, in industrial policy, the goal is to create what we call horizontal linkages within an industrial zone, where you have a bunch of companies creating value and passing on their output to become the input for the next company next door. And that's how you retain the most value added within the industrial complex and within the local economy. We want to create that kind of ecosystem, and it is happening. So that broader ecosystem that goes beyond Intel is where a lot of the education and job creation potential is, especially on the higher end. Because if you think of just the Intel factory, and if you strip it down to its core, it's an extractive industry, not in the hip sense of the term, in the sense that we're literally from Central Ohio, we'll be exporting a bunch of water, a bunch of clean air, and a bunch of raw material that's been put together with high-tech equipment by Intel and exported to the rest of the world. So in that sense, it's extractive of the resources from the local area. Yes, it pays decent wages, but how do we create a much broader multiplier effect that's not as extractive of natural resources? So the companies that will be setting up next door, that will be doing the coding, the innovation, the other research and development that's not as extractive in terms of natural resources, we want more of that to balance out the core Intel ecosystem. And all of that requires substantial investment in education and training and infrastructure, so that it's the majority of young Ohio generation, diverse generation, on-ramping into this industrial ecosystem, as opposed to it being just extractive and bringing labor from the outside because we haven't invested enough in our schools, in our kids, in our infrastructure. That's got to be kind of the long-term policy discussion, and that starts today, not after the fact.
And just add to that, Fidel, it's hugely capital intensive. So I think the figures talked about was something like a $20 billion investment that would create around 3,000 permanent jobs, more construction jobs in the short term, but the construction jobs won't last very long. So that's a bit less than $7 million of capital investment for each individual job.
Right.
Which, you think about it in terms of the individual that gets that job, if they had the $6.7 million, they could buy a house and retire and buy a house for their kids too, and beyond that. So it's this path towards employment being more and more capital intensive is not necessary. I mean, we need the chips, but it also doesn't feel like a brilliant solution to the problem of we actually need more good jobs, because if you need that much capital to support them, is this the best thing to be doing? All of that, I'm not the economist here, but I struggle with that because and how much money has been invested in order to support this, the creation of these jobs. Because again, you put the $100 million figure in education, which sounds absolutely fantastic, enough to pay for 200 kids to go through university at a fancy college, doesn't seem like very much.
Not enough. Yeah, absolutely.
So we're getting to the top of the hour. So in our final 5 minutes together, Carolyn, what can the audience here likes to take action. What are things the audience can do? There's a lot of audience members in Ohio, by the way. So what are things people in Ohio can do, and what are things people nationally can do?
People can contact Intel and ask them to be a true leader of sustainability, to honor their word and their commitments, and also to put pressure on their elected leaders on opening up green energy, taking away the restrictions that the state legislature has actually created law to reduce the ability of green energy. So they're bringing all this money in, all these jobs, and the governor is all about them. So have them use their influence on the governor and on our lawmakers to, get with it, and let's get green in this state. Let's be a sustainable state. Let's move into the next century of innovation. And I would ask folks to do that. And I also would like folks to think about the concept of rights of nature, not just the rights of corporations and rights of people, but the nature around us deserves to thrive and to exist, and they're the ones that keep us alive. So we need to protect our nature. And so rights of nature, look into that, and then contact the governor, contact Intel, and contact your legislator and say, we need green energy, truly green energy. And we need to hold each industry to the highest standard of sustainability.
Great. Get engaged, get action. We've had some previous ESGXs on how best to call your representatives and how best to call your government leaders. And when contacting companies, not only can you vote your shares, like Nigel has put in the chat, but you can write investor relations because it's their job to, and you, each of you, if you have a 401k or if you have a portfolio or if you have an S&P 500 fund, you own shares of Intel. So you are, you're part of the ownership base. Fadl, how would you like to sum up in our final minutes?
I'll take this to the state and federal level. It's the policy action needed in addition to transparency and holding Intel to the highest environmental standards. The state and the federal government cannot continue to neglect communities, neglect people. For example, the lowest income communities in Licking County, if they're going to take advantage of the job creation opportunity at Intel, there is no transportation for them to get to the Intel site. Will there be public transportation to bring workers to the site? Where is the investment in that infrastructure? Where is the investment in after school programs and summer camps and educational training facilities to actually bring a new generation of Intel workers? Otherwise, if we bring workers from outside, that's great for the new workers, but that means we continue the neglect and socioeconomic exclusion of people who are here in Licking County in Central Ohio. And that's not necessarily Intel's fault. That's the fault of the state and federal government for continuing the same policies of kind of fiscal austerity in the sense of promoting particular jobs, particular industries, but not investing in communities that can't really get to those jobs because of the lack of skills, lack of infrastructure, lack of transportation, lack of public housing, affordable housing, all of these things. Kind of, we need the wraparound services for this deal to be a net benefit and a win-win for everyone.
Yeah, this is a great point. There's a LinkedIn post on my LinkedIn that is gaining more and more momentum. The state of Utah is protesting the use of environmental social governance, ESG, saying it's politicizing investing. The reality is conservative states underinvest to improve citizens' lives, and that is a political decision. And so the ESG rating of those states is the result of this political decision-making that underinvests in the well-being of the community. And more progressive states actually invest in their citizens, in their health and wealth and earth and equality and trust. So Carolyn, I think this is one of the reasons why you're running for office, which we've put the link here in the chat. I want to thank you both for joining today. Carolyn Harding, thanks for all your leadership and expertise. Dr. Fadl Kaboub, thanks again for bringing system solutions to our discussions here on ESGX. Thank you, Amir Khalegi, for the monthly Green Jobs Report and the deeper dive into Ohio, and to our producer, Nick Gower of HIP. Nigel, you want to wrap up and preview what's coming up next time on ESGX?
Fantastic. Thank you all very much. Well, I think the one thing to say is we, for the first time in more than 2 years, last week's episode fell victim to COVID. I'm happy to report everybody is fine and recovering. We will reschedule that probably in mid-June. This was about the bioeconomy boom. And then we will be in touch regarding various other episodes we have coming up. We have some really interesting guests planned. And of course, our regular monthly Green Jobs events. So thank you all very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time on ESGX Live.